Thank you, everybody. We've now got 5 further respondents, and I'm really pleased to hand over to Joanna Zalinska, who is Professor of Media Philosophy and Critical Design Practice at King's College London. Joanna, if I could hand over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. You can hear me okay now? Yes, thank you. Well, thanks so much for the invitation and the beautiful prospectus, which arrived like a gift with the kind of vocabularies, ways of thinking that were already very much interwoven with what I was sensing and trying to figure out myself. So by way of response, I've prepared a short performance, which is a way of enacting some of the concepts that are kind of an encounter as well between your ways of trying to map the world and my own ways of thinking, mapping, sketching things out with words, images, and ideas. So my way of approaching the problem of inhabitation with all the precarity it carries is through adopting the position of a feminist eco-ecopunk, departing from the traditional philosophical method of avoiding the present, doubting the example, and remaining suspicious about praxis. My media thinking is also a form of media making, and through this of world making. So the feminist eco-ecopunk I offer is not an aesthetic stand. It's first and foremost an ethical position on how to live in a media dirty world. The ecolalia sounding concept of eco-ecopunk riffs on variations of the science fiction genre that merge punk's irreverent aesthetic with a creative mobilization of cancelled futurity, while providing it with a relevant cultural imprint. From the original punk, eco-ecopunk inherits an adversarial relationship to consensus reality. From cyberpunk, it borrows a gritty dystopian view of the techno-future in which one gets by making do. Eco-ecopunk embraces the irreverent and self-sustaining spirit of punk, but also reworks cyberpunk's sense of general alienation into a form of active and creative engagement with the world's decaying systems and infrastructures. In foregrounding the intertwined aspects of unfolding ecological, economic disasters, this eco-ecopunk de-romanticizes the decay while giving the situation a political twist. It also multiplies punk's agency beyond the heroism of the singular male outcast survivor. Eco-ecopunk involves acknowledging the complex ensemble of images, data, and infrastructures, yet refusing to hold any of it in my hand, mind, or eye as just an object of analysis. Let me just now change my background for the second part to show you another image. Okay, so this is another image from my practice called planetary exhalation, as in inhale, exhale. And as part of this eco-ecopunk mode of working, I want to offer another concept, which I call loser images, as a figuration that challenges the dominant ways of planetary vision and planetary inhabitation. The loser images figuration follows in the footsteps of Heather Steil, whose kin notion of poor images describes lossy digital images traversing the network personal computers of our globe. Their poverty referred to the low quality and low resolution as a result of the incessant replication on ever cheaper media. But it also pointed to the wider condition of cultural disjuncture, where the impoverishment of many image producers and image subjects went hand in hand with the enrichment of those in control of digital infrastructures. My loser images are precisely such poor images of the world, serving as counterpoints to the amazing drone-like views of planet Earth we are so used to seeing these days. There is something not quite right with them as both representations and captures. The worldview they present is out of sync, wobbly, smeary, somehow degraded. Yet loser images are not just mine. The concept is primarily meant to serve as a viewing, structuring, and archiving device, allowing to develop a counter-visuality from what's already there. So the eco-punk ethos that drives the production of such illusory images has affinities with Polish philosopher Ewa Majewska's notion of the avant-garde of the weak, a mode of working which combines the feminist rejections of patriarchal visions of genius and creativity and emancipatory claims originating in the peripheries with their demand for an expanded epistemology, one including marginalized and colonized territories in art, history, and practice. In the spirit of the avant-garde of the weak, my eco-punk approach offers a possibility to overcome the individualism of performance and spectatorship via a commonality of experiencing failure and weakness, again citing Majewska, or at least to stage this failure and weakness as a shared experience. So just to round up, in the media ecology of eco-punk, the hero's name is Legion, and they may not even be just human. As well as envisaging new ways of engaging with the environment while showing it as always already mediated, this mode of practice opens up a traditional cyberpunk ethos to the plurality of voices, sensibilities, and sensations. The concept of eco-punk encapsulates this very spirit of more than one that is so present in your prospectus, a community of confluences and contaminations that goes beyond the experience of a disaffected loner from outside the cultural mainstream, fighting totalitarian corporations with his wit and kit. Eco-punk reverberates with the multiplicity of actors, human and non-human ones, who are at work in the system. The recognition of this plural and entangled ontology of our ecologies, which are always already media ecologies, is a first step towards outlining contours of an eco-punk ethos which has progressive ramifications. Eco-punk recognizes not only the benefits of living with advanced technology, but also the fact that humans are originarily technical beings, that we have emerged and evolved with and via diverse objects and practices such as plows, fire, wheels, agriculture, cooking and transportation, a mode of breaking out of the echo chamber of the conventional responses to the Anthropocene that remain rooted in affects such as doom and gloom. Eco-punk sees the world as always already media dirty, embroiled, entangled, enmeshed. Yet dirt is not positioned here as something to be overcome for a civilization to take place and hold together. It's rather seen as our civilization's constitutive element. Dirt is also a reminder of the remainder as in a conduit of mediation. Eco-punk therefore becomes a proposal for those who recognize themselves and the world around them as always already media dirty. It's a mode of acting for those for whom ecology connects via wires and wirelessly to the media infrastructures that organize the world and that shape our position in the world. Last but not least, eco-punk speaks to those who would rather be cyborgs than goddesses, and for whom art making and world making function as inevitable technical prostheses for a human embedded in the world and becoming with the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. That was wonderful. It makes us think about different ways we can deal with the ambiguity and ambivalence we feel about the present and the past, and be generative of new options or new ways of thinking about the future through eco-punk. That was really nice. Thank you very much. And I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, Kavita Philip, who is President's Excellence Chair in Network Cultures, University of British Columbia. Kavita, over to you, please.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Malik. I'm going to start by echoing the praise that all of us have heaped upon this. I'll go into a bit of a critical riff that's less a critique than some suggested extensions, picking up on some of the threads that Brian Larkin introduced before he got cut off. And I'll end with a sample of my current collaborative matters of concern that I think you'll see some resonances with. So first, I'm most excited by global collaboration at the center of this. So you mentioned urban labs around the world. You also mentioned challenging Western epistemologies. I'm inspired by care and collectivity as the hope at the center of this piece. So you mentioned prioritizing care, repair, and collective support to reshape the potential of urban technicity. I love the open-ended, experimental, tentative, transversal, and radical relationship with the unknown and with the hopeful. I agree with your nuanced, dynamic understanding of urban technicity. So for instance, away from a narrow focus on technology, you say, means opening up imaginaries and also subtle forms of refusal. I'm intrigued by putting abolitionism and Anthropocene in the same frame. And I want to hear more along the lines Beth Coleman opened up about how both are forms of planning and technique. I want to think with you about what is entailed by the exploration you invite us to. So you ask what kinds of urban living can be made through the technical, and you talk about going beyond technological domination. You also talk about extensions as augmentations of information and so on. Now, this is the intersection at which I think, shaped by my training in both STS and radical history, history does appear in your project as haunting. Quote, the city is haunted by all that might have taken place or by spectral propositions. The radical reformulation proposed here seeks to, quote, reimagine and draw new intersections between understandings of habitation and the technical. Of course, I'm on board with this, eager to participate in the forging of this future urban techno-social politics. But I want to think about how our implicit models of history or popular notions of how we got here and what we're up against shape our eagerness for this future-oriented task, what Brian marked as the novel, the new. Here is your diagnosis of the technological problem. Quote, certain tech solutions have taken the limelight, but everyday low-tech hacks and workarounds, creative means to navigate precarity have been overlooked. And here is your diagnosis of the social political problem. Quote, a linear top-down problem solution mindset reproduces a reductionist quick fix. So I want to caution that if we define the problem as one of top-down reductionism versus bottom-up flexibility, we could easily fall into doing again with some technical elaborations, a kind of urban studies we know well, but we might end up fighting the last battle and not the current one. I'm all for fighting states and corporations who impose a top-down mindset. I'm on the bandwagon to fight reductionism. After all, this is why people love reading Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State. It offered a good critique of the top-down model of power. But Scott's work was always already out of date, perhaps by design. States had already pivoted in the 1990s to valorizing the bottom billion. I think of Julia Eliachar's work on the bottom of the pyramid. The poor's creative workarounds and everyday hacks were valorized as precisely the kind of bottom-up resilience that would fuel the next economic boom. Corporations have ridden the highs of the gig economy through the exacerbated precarities of the pandemic. The CIA has long encouraged bottom-up civil society protest movements in places they thought needed regime change, from China to Venezuela. Entrepreneurs of various kinds understand well that the bottom-up model has overturned traditional political economy and even supplemented war maneuvers, so asymmetrical warfare, military operations on urban terrain, or MOUT, where they learn rhizomatic tactics from Deleuze and from histories of guerrilla warfare, combined with studies of urban space. So look at the work of Eyal Weizman, for instance. Top-down reductionist policies go hand in hand with flexible strategies that profit from precarity. States have not abandoned the power of the military and the threat of genocide, which are no doubt top-down powers that will always play a role in accumulation and governance. State authoritarianism clears the way and provides the uplifting rhetoric for the flattening of economic networks, for instance, via digital payments, for example, Indian demonetization. Genocidal policies against oppressed castes in India or indigenous people in Brazil or the Philippines are carried out in the name of democratizing modernization. I think this month of the hijab ban in Karnataka in India in the name of secular democratic education. Top down and bottom up go hand in hand in the policies of the urban technical. If we retain simple models of them, top-down reductionists versus us, bottom-up, resilient, precarious urban inhabitants, we are already ceding half the terrain to the forces of urban technical domination. The resilience of the precarious, the inventiveness and creativity of those who live on nothing and are still the objects of expropriation are indeed inspiring. And yes, we must live and write with, along, and beside these struggles. But in recognizing precarity's inspiration for our radical hopes, we must also recognize precarity as it is being packaged into the resilient salvation of capitalism's flexible new orders. It's, quote, maneuvering and hustling, grafting and shifting, as you put it, is simultaneously the shape of resistance from below against capital, as well as the fabric of capital's new clothes. In other words, I'm suggesting that you already see this process and that we could explore together the ways in which tech, political economy, and cultures of protests shape each other. If I have time, in order to move beyond praise and critique, which I've done in your wonderful open-ended proposal, I want to end with you by thinking with collaborative work I've been doing with a postdoc fellow at UBC, Paroma Wagle, who's in the audience. In keeping with your proposal, our project is an open-ended urban study. We conceive of our outcomes not only as publications or archives, but the formulation of a global speaking, acting network of urban activists with scholars as second line, not first line. So here's a section on technology from our work in progress. It's a co-authored paper called The Unmaking of the Mumbai Working Classes. We invoke history and temporality as you do. Here we're echoing E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. In these passages that I'll share, we play with the temporal and spatial processes of making and unmaking, as well as with the idea of urban technical storytelling. So our fundamental claim, as yours is that technology shapes political economy. The Boston Consulting Group says India's gig economy, a sector whose worth will grow to next year, we think, but to 455 billion. And it's likely to grow from a current 8 million jobs to 24 million jobs next year or the year after. Now, India's rich history of labor struggle means that this assumed natural progression from labor protection to ruthlessly extractive systems will not happen without resistance. We already chronicle resistance. But crises like COVID-19 and specifically the way the Indian state in the first wave threw low-wage and migrant workers into life-threatening precarity have hastened a deep subversion of the traditional bargaining position of labor. This shift is caused in large part by computational technologies that allow peer-to-peer interaction. P2P platforms precipitate foundational shifts in political economy, and COVID-19 has intensified, it didn't create, but intensified informality in labor practices. And again, I echo Keith Breckenridge's early work. So I'll finish up in 1 minute. Thanks, Simon. To sum up, tech moves us from factory machines to software and computational platforms. Political economy moves from industrial capitalism to platform capitalism, but we don't lose the old. These are palimpsestic superpositions. And labor, from being collectively embodied and housed together on the factory floor in housing, becomes apparently atomized, interacting only through the app. The mode of organizing resistance to exploitation in the 19th century was a formation of class collectivity, strikes, slowdowns, labor unions. Right now, we're in the process of a deep unmaking of that class, but also a remaking through caste, gender, global and regional alliances. So I'll stop there, noting that what we're doing together is chronicling both a making and an unmaking. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kavita, for embracing the spirit of the programme, but also those points about a sensitivity to which precarity and sort of state corporate technoscience are intimately interconnected, and an awareness and sensitivity to the potential productive nature of those tension relations. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to our next respondent, Lucina Parisi, who's Professor at the Programme in Literature and Computational Media, Art and Culture at Duke University. Lucina, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Malik and Beth and everyone else for having invited me, for sharing your thought with us today. I'm going to just give some few thoughts about the perspectives. I was very pleased to read it, and as everyone has already mentioned, there are definitely resonances towards what is possible to think with the technical and the urban. I'm actually teaching now a course on computational architecture and using this idea of the operating urban system, and your book as well, Simon. And it's very interesting to have this discussion with the student as much as trying to locate possibility of critique, right? So for my concern today is with proposition and provocation about what we mean, first of all, by habitation and inhabitation. As we inherit these concepts, and unfortunately within the history of philosophy, they are very attached to the possibility of inhabitation and habitation that come from the idea of home, the idea of dwelling. There's a strong tradition in Heideggerian thinking about it, and I think it's what the urban technical, your prospectus does is to actually help us to question what do we think the earth is, what do we think the world is, what do we think the infrastructure is. So the idea of habitat and habitation, this concept brings together habit, and habit today, as we have already discussed and is fully present in your prospectus, is the way automation, for instance, and computational platforms are habituating the urban technical to particular possibility, to selected possibilities, but also maintain within itself this idea that we know what is dwelling, we know what is home, and we think that the world, that there are ways of dwelling in the world as we know it already. And that's what I would like to question. What do we think the world is? And how the urban technical can help us in this collaboration amongst all our different kind of interests and experimentation and critical stances with the technical. What can it open up? What the technical, urban technical can open up in terms of rethinking what the world is, and how to challenge this idea that we know what the world is. So one thing about the urban technical that also resonated with an important question for me is how to challenge the universal question of technology. And there was a mention before by Brian about, this almost what I heard in understanding different forms of technoculture, different forms of what Yuko is called cosmotechnics. How cosmotechnics can relate to the universal question of technology and already break out from this kind of technical as we know it, and habituation of the technical as we know it. The problem with the cosmotechnic is for me not just about thinking about after the modern or after the crisis of man, or a moment before the universal question of technology and before what has been called racial capitalism, by Cedric Robinson, and also the problem of how the technical is embedded with colonial patriarchal and capitalism. So in a way, when we think philosophically or critically the question of the technical, there is a necessity of challenging not only the pillars of philosophy, but the pillars of philosophy in conjunction with racial capitalism and patriarchy. For me, therefore, rethink of the urban technical is not just about retooling the technical, but must be so in terms, and again, I echo Brian, but also Beth, I think, how the word can be hacked and must be hacked in terms of abolitionist practices. So what does it mean about the thinking the abolitionist practices in relation to cosmotechnics? For me, it's not a question of an ontological role of cultural difference, but it's actually how to refuse cultural difference as the primary descriptor of the abolition and of a model of the technical, and how we then can reimagine a model of the technical outside cultural difference. This is also a way in which we have inherited within critical theory. So challenger way we have inherited within critical theory the idea of the opposition towards instrumentality. And here I'm referring to the inheritance of critical theory in its kind of most original form of the Frankfurt School and the critique of instrumental reason. For me, there is something in that critique that we have inherited that actually make us neglect the very reformulation and thinking of the means in terms of know-hows and practices of reasoning that instead are opposed within the kind of contemporary discourse and critique of automation to possibilities of freedom from automation, or the complaint against the end of reason and the end of freedom vis-a-vis automation. So the question is really, again, what can, if rethinking abolitionist practices must come together with the critique of the question of freedom as the pillar of ontological claim about cultural difference. So what is the role of critique in this sense? And this is the way when I talk about hacking possibility, I'm really much influenced and turned towards and inspired by the work of Sadia Hartman, but also Denise Ferreira da Silva, who talk about the possibilities of hacking this world as we know it. What does it mean that the technical or can actually offer the possibility of hacking the world as we know it against the given institutional and monetary frameworks of art, of university, and of social media. Sadia Hartman offers us this concept of critical fabulation, which we can re-articulate in relation to questions of we can articulate in relation to problem of when we talk about the technical and automation and the critique that is posed towards, okay, we need more clarity, we need more transparency, we need to recuperate the subject, we need to recuperate the object. And this kind of tension between transparency, clarity, critique, and recuperation of the subject, even in the form of a kind of weaker subject, somehow overlook the practices of abolition and the transversal practices of abolition in this possibility of critically fabulating what has already happened what is already embedded in the world of automation that not just resist the world of automation. One can think about, errors in algorithm or randomness in computation or indeterminacy in computer logic and so on, but also how these practices have not just maintained a kind of trace within the system, right? So we have talked about how biases or epistemologies of colonial epistemology, or what in some of the work I've done recently called recursive colonialisms, are embedded in these techno-social and techno-urban systems, but they are not just the traces that haunt or menace or threaten the system, but they are, for me, coexistent within the system. There are know-hows that are repressed within the system and nonetheless exist as a kind of oncology of the system. So what do I mean by this oncology? This idea of the oncology of the technical is something that I take from Octavia Butler. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, Luciana.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, but could I ask you to one
Have I
more
finished? It
Yes,
says 4 minutes. 4 seconds, yeah.
Yes.
Is it 4
Thank
seconds or
you.
4 minutes? Okay, sorry.
Sorry to
So
interrupt.
yeah, this practice of the of an oncology and not an ontology, that inspired by Octavia Butler, discussion of how the oncali in Xenogenesis, this trilogy, are fascinated by the capacity of Lilith cells to have a code for cancerous cells that are, some kind of marker of the existence of a trauma that actually can, by being engineered in another space, become actually possibilities for recoding the structure of power. So I'll just finish like that. Thank you.
So my most recent work resonates greatly with the thinking orientation and broader aims of this research program. Indeed, the opening epigraph by Malik very much encapsulates the perspective that issues out of and undergirds my own work, which has been informed by Malik's important work, viewing roads, buildings, pipes, wires as parts of infrastructure, as feeling out and apprehending. This to me is a marvelous way to think about hardened technologies of connection and transmission, that is, as sentient and intelligent processes of relating alongside more evidently embodied beings such as animals, viruses, and humans. I have in fact drawn on Simone's work precisely to account for the importance of the enrolled capacities and faculties of a global stratum of disposable servants or service workers as forms of vital infrastructure, which serve to enhance and facilitate the value productive lives and life movements of a global political citizenry in a global urbanist platform economy, which I have called City Everywhere and is part of my forthcoming book. Undoubtedly, this function of disposable peoples as reproductive machinery for circulation as production in today's capitalist platform economy could be considered part of the dominant urban technical shaping contemporary conditions of inhabitation in metropolitan spaces everywhere in the global South, as well as in the global North. However, it is also the case that the modalities and practices of social reproduction of this stratum of disposable life, and my focus is largely on Philippine populations, that their practices of social reproduction exceed its production for the needs of capital. What is hidden from view, yet also serves as subaltern engines of this new political economy, and in particular, the centrality of financialized capital, are what I have called vital platforms, or kin-based networks of social survival of migrant workers and their translocal and transnational households and communities. These social networks of living, while interfaced with capitalist platforms, and in fact, if you know anything about Filipino workers, they are the biggest source of content moderation, and among is the biggest source of call centers, along with India and other places. But they are very much part of the business process outsourcing and multiple platforms. But the way that I understand them as vital platforms are precisely how I understand forms of urban technical beyond the narrow reductionist technological views. Vital platforms are networks comprised of active mediatic conduits of transmission, transaction, augmentation, depletion, conversion, and redemption of values in multiple currencies, collective means of life, and the very life itself of shared being, pragmatic, distributional, and allocational social mediatic systems for the self-replenishing and self-renewal of these domestic communities whose members are individual components, programmers, as well as users. Here I draw on Simondon's passing comments on non-noble techniques as the techniques related to living beings, one equated with slaves, utility artisans, children, and primitive societies, to think about the other practices of inhabitations that are part of a more broadly conceived urban technical and bear a longer history and other genealogy than the dominant urbanist views would allow, a concern that was raised by Brian and others, including historically and currently being imperially conscripted to serving as associated milieus for that technical object called capital. And here I'm also relying on work that shows that kinship rules have been crucial in the maintenance and thriving of ethno-linguistic communities through deep time, playing an active role in channeling the language persistence and transmission, and therefore know-hows, right, non-noble techniques, over the very diverse geographical spread of migrating Austronesian societies, dealing with dynamic and shifting environmental climatic conditions, as well as colonial conditions across the vast Pacific, from the Philippines to Easter Island and across even up to Madagascar over centuries and millennia. As you can see, my own thinking very much resonates with the project here. What it seems to me important to cultivate, however, is a certain cultural technical literacy in and forms of study of the different forms of expertise and strategies that the marginalized possess, the protocols they rely on, revise, and improvise in literally making life work. And here the interdisciplinary approach of the project is key. However, I do think we might voice an obvious concern, which is not to replicate the habitual practice of Western scholarship to see the marginalized as resources and potentials. And as Kavita Philip already also mentioned, which Capital also already does in its contemporary valorization of waste and disposability. I think the stated understanding of this project as imagining and affecting the interactions between technical instruments, collective knowledge, urban politics, and economic practice behooves us to reimagine our own ways of working and our own relations to the poor and dispossessed, to not dispossess them further, and to model and participate in experimental economies of work and cooperative exchange, to test out with other actors, bringing our own forms of expertise into cooperative and collaborative relation with a range of actors in particular sites. Here I'm thinking of an ongoing collaborative project I am involved in called initially Forum on Equitable and Sustainable Communitarian Organization for Art and Culture, which began with a series of conversations with activists and artists in the Philippines on creating a network of sustainable self-financing arts and culture collectives by reflecting existing independent and alternative socially cooperative economies of cultural production, bypassing metropolitan cultures, while still keeping channels open to them, this time regulated by local or provincial networks. And this is quite contrast to the political delinking project from decades ago. And it relies on the very logic of gift economies, which depends on opening and closing channels of connection. So we hope to build on the actual practice of activist networks relying on favors and services with in-house connections, as well as logics and know-hows of sociality and gift economies, or in the Philippines, they're called help economies. These vital platforms that Philippine communities are very familiar with, thinking about how not to formalize, but rather to bolster through encoding, recoding, remembering, and inscribing through contemporary digital technologies, including blockchain, as well as multimedia art and performance, which addresses the question of archiving and not exactly formalizing, I would say, but coding, in order to enable participation and support across communities locally and transnationally in the experimental creation of another potentially expandable political platform that also serves as one economy of livelihoods that would include art, services, farming, goods making. So I am very excited by the range of forms of expertise reflected here and the experimental possibilities that it opens up. It seems to me, however, important to think about the protocols of sociality that we ourselves are making and with whom, the very forms of inhabitation and economies of life making we reproduce or revise in our collaborative projects. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nefertiti. You're making us think about how do we organise knowledge production in ways that don't replicate the problems that we're trying to address. Thank you very much for those insightful comments. And I'd like to pass over to our last respondent. I'd like to welcome Philip Butler, who's Assistant Professor of Theology and Black Post-Human AI Systems at the Iliff School of Theology. Philip, if I could pass over to you, please.
Hey, thanks, Simon. Glad to be joining you all today. Very quickly, I'll just talk a little bit about a Black post-humanist approach to thinking about the urban technical in this way and inhabitation. And so I think one of the things I wanted to think about is the differentiation from a Black post-humanist perspective that would separate the idea of humanity and people, right? I think if we're following kind of a trajectory of like the various ways that the human has followed kind of the Enlightenment trajectory, and it's diffused itself within various kind of secular and subsequent like religious modalities in terms of how people understand what a human is. And then we have kind of this use of these synonym terms in terms of what a person is, who are people, and then what is a human, but also the sliding scale of who gets to be seen as a human. Then I think one of the things we can think about in terms of the urban technical and inhabitation is making technology, inhabitable technology and digital technologies more local and more complex. And by that, I want to encourage us to think about the ways in which the human is a kind of a universal construction whereby we think we understand what a human is. But if we're also just being kind of honest in terms of this Enlightenment trajectory, historically we see, that there's particularly one form of human that has been kind of given the credence of what it is to be a human, the gateway to humanity, so to speak. And so if we look at kind of the various ways in which folks in the global majority, again, folks outside of this kind of Western European archetype or prototype, then we could think about the various ways different people show up in the ways in which their cultures and their bodies and their own sciences and their own understandings of the world and their perspectives are shaping and have shaped how they bring themselves to social environments, the social political sphere, and navigate different kind of geopolitical spaces as a result of coloniality. And so as a result of that, if we can think about making technology for people as opposed to humans, and I think what we can do is actually make technology a bit more precise and a bit more clear and a bit more synchronistic in terms of how it actually is in relationship with the people that we're talking about. If we're talking about the increase or rapid urbanization of the world and the various ways in which folks are coming to these urban spaces, and then talking about the ways in which we have to account for the complexity of how people show up in these various urban spaces, then I think it's imperative for us to think about the ways in which we design technologies in ways that are particular to the local and the complex as they show up. And by local, we can think of this as simple as a household. We can think of the local as one individual. We can think of the local as a floor on a tenement block. The entire tenement itself, all the way to the neighborhoods, to the cities, so on and so forth. And so we can get as local as we like, but I think at all times the idea is to be complex. And I think jumping from that point, especially from a Black perspective, one of the things that I wanted to also invite us to think about is data, right? And I think we've seen various ways in which within the last few years talks have been surfacing about data as labor, but I also want to shift that and maybe think about data as citation. I think when we talk about the ways in which Black culture has shifted the world and been very key in what is considered culture or cool or innovative, but we also the ways in which kind of whiteness and Western European society has refused to cite Blackness or cite different forms of creativity and culture as it has arisen from the diaspora right there. I think that the practice of denigration and then appropriation and then the economic use of kind of reselling these cultural spaces back to folks. I think if we begin to think about data as citation as opposed to simply labor, then we could trace the ways in which the creators and the innovators of certain things have not only shifted larger modes of culture, but also we can see where the reach and the ways in which ideas have germinated and the ways in which kind of things have transformed over time. And so kind of thinking about data as labor is this way. And I think that what that also would do is maybe usher in a different kind of era, whereby when we start thinking about the types of technologies that are on the horizon and are still part of our imagination, and often what we're working towards in different spheres, especially in industry, the type of technologies that are coming require almost a different approach to privacy. And you could argue in many cases that privacy won't exist in various futures. But if that's the case, then the trust factor has to be there. And I think that's part of where data as citation could be very much so utilized, because if people trust that they will get credit for the things that they have created, and if they trust the ways in which their data is not only being kind of siphoned or leveraged or utilized, then that's maybe something that might welcome the type of data sharing that will require the types of technologies that we're talking about. Because I think we're also talking about technological advances. Like if you walk up to given Amazon one, you walk in and out of the store, the type of data that you've already shared with Amazon, and you think about the ways in which these technologies are only the beginning for, say, smart cars having access to different data sets via the neighborhoods that they ride in. And so if you're walking to a predominantly Black neighborhood, maybe, there's an awareness of the smart vehicles that be able to recognize Black bodies, as opposed to moving to other neighborhoods that may be able to recognize different bodies, and what that means in terms of not only privileging and seeing folks through computer vision, but also giving people the opportunity to be treated as kind of viable and legible modes of functioning within these kind of technological spheres. And so so ultimately, I'll now wrap up here, is roughly the idea of if we think about people in terms of localized and complex, and how that becomes the ways in which we live alongside technology, and how technology will advance within the urban. If we begin to think about data as citation, and then we get to think about the trust and the ways in which this data will allow for a continuation of the type of innovation that we're looking towards, but think of it as a more collaborative and in a collaborative way to see where things came from, and be able to trace that into futures kind of far beyond our own.
Many thanks, Philip. I think you're asking us to think about the urban technical and the human, and the nature of the human as well, and particularly the datafied self. Many thanks for those comments, and many thanks to all the respondents for your generosity, thoughtfulness, constructiveness, and engagement with the themes set out in the signature programme. It's been really interesting to hear your perspectives, suggestions, and the constructive nature of those. I'd just like to hand over to Malik at this stage for the last part of today's dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Simon, for coordinating all of the inputs. I guess we're running out of time, so I guess maybe just to pose a kind of general question that comes to mind after these really incisive reflections, comments. I don't know if we'll have time to discuss it, but just to sort of set the stage maybe for further discussion. I guess to paraphrase, Neferti, particularly some of what she raises in her forthcoming book, is, what is a collective life worth living? And what is that collective? What does it mean to be a collective at this point? and if we have some idea about what that is, well, what is it that's worth living, and how do we get there? And how do we get there based on some kind of better understanding of how we got to where we are so far? And in some ways, if there's this notion of collective life, then this, as people have said, the co-constitution of a history of being technical all the way down, with an unsettled politics with an inhabitation that remains always unsettled. What kind of collective formulation is that? And to what extent does it somewhere parallel what Harney and Moten have talked about in their latest writing about a kind of process of incompletion, a process of incompletion that allows for unexpected encounters that can never be fully summed up. And it reminds me then of the dilemma, some of the conundrums around this relationship between visibility, clarity, transparency, invisibility, opacity, and how one thinks that through. And I mean, if you take the sort of great Black Ecoecopunk Janelle Monáe and her notions of dirty computing, in some ways with what Monet is thinking about is in some ways the affective indifference to being dispossessed, of being someone whose processor is wiped out, and so always vulnerable to being extracted from that resilience, that flexibility, that creativity, whatever is, you know, as many people have, but a kind of affective indifference to that, with a kind of attitude that no matter what you try to extract, it's never what you think it's going to be. And so there's a kind of dispossession, but at the same time for her, the dirty computing is something that doesn't compute. It's the abolishing of a certain kind of narrative, a certain kind of order, a certain kind of logic. And whether or not this relationship between this kind of dispossession and abolishment is what might be construed with Denise Ferrer da Silva saying differences without separability. And so do these differences without separability, how do they appear in our notion of the relationship between the visible and the invisible? I mean, people have talked about the way in which important new infrastructures, data information infrastructures, technological affordances, systems of control and monitoring remain largely invisible and therefore not apprehendable in fundamental ways. But we also know that there are significant practices of fugitivity that remain also invisible, that you don't show your cards, you don't show what it is that you have because you know that it'll be stolen from. At the same time, as Catherine McKittrick says, the burden of invisibility is so great that in a ways you can't just simply celebrate the kind of opacity of the subaltern. But we also know, as people have said, that certain modes of appearance, certain kinds of objects remain disorienting. And so we have the possibility of what some have called counter-visuality. So I guess what I'm asking is, in the terms of the question of what constitutes a collective life worth living, given all of the continuities of a system of extraction and value formation, capital axiomatics that will turn everything into the fodder of its own accumulation. How do we think about what's then visible and not visible? And what's the role of technicity in helping us think through this kind of complicated politics? In a world that is dirty, gritty, wild, and in some ways, how do we think how do you make dirty computing in the service of a kind of collective life worth living?